Once again, my name is Matawashte Winyang, which means good bear woman. My English name is Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy, and I am a native theologian and a mom and all the things, in a lot of pain. I took my son to Disneyland this last week. So 22,000 steps in one day is a lot. And we did that for 5 days in a row, so I'm feeling it. I am honored and blessed to be able to kind of give a response to Dr. Cynthia. And I have to be honest, I told my son, and he was coming, but as a theologian, I fangirl to only a few people, and you are one of them. I just really look up to you. And so when I knew that we were speaking, I'm so nervous. So I'm not going to look at you. And I hope I got this good. But I just love it. And my son just laughed, just like, Mom. And I'm like, no. And he's like, you're such a nerd. And I'm like, well then, yes, I am. But I've learned so much, and I'm so grateful. And I took notes. I don't know if y'all did, but I was over there, like, I was taking notes. And so I even altered a little about what I was going to say. But as Dr. Cynthia said, we are living in a really pivotal moment in history, and that's not a cliche, right? I say this for myself from like the bones of my people, from the songs that just rise in our blood to the stories that are just carried through generations, right? From the lands, I think that have held both our ceremonies and our suffering. There is something sacred about being alive right now. Even when it doesn't feel that way. When hope feels like it's just kind of running dry, or kind of like that dry mouth, you've got dust in your mouth, it's just dry, right? Even when the world feels just way too broken, too cruel, too far gone. There is something about this moment. Because I think, as you mentioned, we are born into this moment. Not to turn away, but to turn towards each other, to stand in that kind of aching truth of what is, and I still believe that what is coming, right? That there's, to still believe that something beautiful, something just something sacred can be born within all of this chaos that is going on. I think you kind of alluded to, and this comes from a little bit of our conversation the other night, that we are not witnessing the end, but the labor of something new, right? And if we listen really closely to the land, right? If we listen really closely to the land, which is creation, which is our family, which is all of us, to that pain, to each other, we're going to hear creation herself groaning. But it's not groaning in death, but in the struggle to bring forth that renewal. There are forces, I think, that would have us forget this. From what I hear, from what I'm understanding, right? That it spoke a little bit about that predatory capitalism, right? That whispering that our worth is found only in what maybe we produce or what we consume, or maybe it's the systemic racism, right? That systemic racism which just dehumanizes, divides, and it profits from our pain. And these aren't just political or economic problems. They are spiritual wounds, right? They are the stories we've been told about power, about worth, about separateness, right? The thing is If you look at this both from a native or an indigenous worldview and that faith-rooted lens, we know that this is a violation of what is sacred. Because in both, we also have to understand that we do not exist in isolation. We are made from relationship. I talked about that earlier this morning, right? That we are made from relationship, from breath and water and land and language, from God, creator, kin, from ancestors, family, everyone who walked before us, and the descendants that we are called to care for. That the dominant culture sometimes wants us to believe otherwise. That our pain is private. That our grief is a weakness. Or that our power is way too small to matter, right? But that's not true. That's not real. And that is certainly not sacred. We are not alone. We've not been created to be alone. We never have been alone in any of this, in whatever it is that you are experiencing. You are not alone. Our stories aren't separate. If you're hearing anything today, our stories aren't separate from each other. They are interwoven, right? And when we gather in spaces like this, we begin to then tell the truth, right? We tell the truth not only about what's happening in the world, but about what's happening inside of us, because that is really important. We've just been conditioned to not share that, to not live in that grief, to push it aside, to forget about it. And in an indigenous worldview or our native worldview, we don't look at the world and as things as linear, right? That we see this line and we keep moving and everything is behind us and we're forgetting about that. That is not how we see things. We live in this kind of circular understanding of the world, that we are always connected. No matter what it is that we experience in life, we name the voices, right? Inside us and around us. And they tell us sometimes that maybe we need to stay small, right? Those voices, or stay silent, right? Don't say anything. Or maybe it's just to settle, right? Settle a little bit for the disparity. But the thing is, we need to name the grief. We need to name the fear. We need to name the rage. Name the numbness. And then remember it. Don't move in that linear where we're moving and we're forgetting what is behind us, because we can't forget what we're connected to. And when we remember that hope is not found in avoiding the pain, but in walking through it together, right? That the sacred is not what floats above the brokenness, but what is forged within that brokenness. That is the messages we're hearing. The story Cynthia told about the compost, that one has stuck with me for a couple of days now, but you know, that compost, it smells like rot, right? It's really gross. But it births new life. All those challenges, all those things, all the stuff, that is going to birth new life, as stinky as it is, right? That in both theology of the cross and in Native teachings, life and death are not opposites. They are part of that sacred cycle that makes us whole. So I'm going to tell you a little story. Well, not a little story, I'm just going to tell you a story. So in 2017, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, when you go into Minneapolis, the Walker Sculpture Garden, right? Like, this has been a savior for me and my son, because my son needs to run, right? And it has these big sculptures that people can walk in and think about and all the different things, right? And in about 2017, the Walker Art Center installed a sculpture titled Scaffold. And it was this towering, life-size wooden structure meant to represent the historic executions by the US government. One of those executions, and that it was modeled after, was the hanging of the Dakota 38. So 38 Dakota men in Mankato in 1862. The largest mass execution in US history. That history lives in my family. So not only do I come from Pine Ridge in the Oglala, I'm also Sanchi Dakota. I always say my grandmother, she was my 3 times great-grandmother, was a part of and her children were part of the 1,700 women, children, mostly elderly, at Fort Snelling, and also the largest prison camp in United States history was here. While my grandmother was there, it would be my uncle, her brother, my grandfather, our cousins were a part of the original 300 men who were imprisoned right after the US-Dakota War. And then what happens is President Lincoln at that time, President Lincoln is in the middle of an election, and he's looking at this list. He's like, I would love to do this, but I can't. Right? And you got to think about it. On his desk at the same time, the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So here's this man having to make these decisions. So he says, send this back and shorten this list with something that I can work with. So then that is where the list of the 38 men come from. So my uncle and my grandfather were then sent to a different prison, and these 38 men were put into this makeshift prison, and they were made to listen to the scaffolding being built, not quite understanding what is going on. And then on December 25th, families are celebrating, the birth of Christ. They're enjoying their families, they're enjoying good food, and these men are in this prison, my family, and then they are, the next day, on December 26th, 5,000 people show up to watch the hanging of my relatives. So speed up to 2017, and I'm standing there, and this is meant to be, so my son at the time is about 6 years old, something that my son could walk up the steps and pretend to pull a lever. Wait, there's no pretending. He could pull a lever to pretend that he was hanging his own family. See, in an indigenous, our native worldview, we don't really separate that kind of time and space is a little bit different in how we see the world. So my son can tell you stories about his Grandpa John. His Grandpa John fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn. Neither one of us knew him, but it's how we are raised to understand and know our family like they were right with us, because they are, right? So my son knows these stories, knows this history. So on the day, right, on the day of this execution back in history, right, in the silence that followed, there were, at that time then, our ceremonies were outlawed. Our languages were pretty much buried, and our ancestors, my grandparents, were exiled from the state of Minnesota. Little known history, if you don't know this, that exile actually still stands today. That structure, standing in this family sculpture garden, wasn't just an installation. It was a wound, completely reopened. It was a gallows with no ceremony, no story, no consent. But the thing was, we didn't stay silent. Our elders gathered, our youth showed up, we prayed, we protested, and then we demanded the removal. But we demanded more than just that. We asked for restoration, for the wood to be returned to the land through ceremony, to be grieved, to be buried, to be transformed. We said no to erasure, and we said yes to healing. You see, on that day, I remember my job was to go around and to smudge and to burn sage and cedar, and I was walking around the crowd, and there was about 500 people there, and you could smell the cedar and the sage, and you could hear the drums playing and the people singing, and there were women crying, and I remember getting to the back of that crowd, and I stopped and I started crying because I got put into the story that I didn't want to be put into. Because I thought, is this what it felt like to experience the death of my family? To have to stand there, the sights, the smells, the sounds, and then to have people not understand that pain, couldn't understand what generational trauma was. I could talk about it, but that moment is what really made me understand what generational trauma is. But it was watching my community stand up and not be silent. That, my friends, is what it means to embody courage, because I wouldn't be standing here as a native theologian, the first in the ELCA and other denominations, right? Having graduated from Luther Seminary and, teaching where I'm teaching and graduating and having this big ceremony in a huge church just a couple miles from where my grandmother was imprisoned and then eventually exiled because people didn't want to understand or know who we were or how we saw the world, right? I learned what it meant to embody that courage. To embody courage isn't always to fight. Sometimes it's about standing still. It's about learning to listen to the stories, to the land, to sing into the silence. Our protests that day were our songs. It was our prayers. It was just being. To bury what must be buried and then tend to what must be born. That is what embodying courage is, from what I'm understanding. It's what Shipra and Pua did in Exodus, right? When they were told to be instruments of death, they instead became protectors of life. Their resistance was quiet, but like I said before, it was holy. They knew that what we often forget, that the sacred lives in our choices, the sacred lives in our choices, right? That in our defiance, in our care. When I stood before that structure, I didn't just see wood and metal. I felt the presence of my family. I felt the weight of that noose disguised as art. And the silence that is all too often demanded of any of us when our pain makes it uncomfortable for others. It was a moment that called us not just to protest, but it was to reclaim. It was through ceremony, through community, to reclaim through truth-telling. And you're listening to Cynthia, Dr. Cynthia, it made me think about the Eucharist, the story, because it's not, the Eucharist isn't just a ritual, right? It needs to be seen as a relationship. That because for us, for someone like me who's Native, a meal is never just a meal, right? It's never just food. It's an exchange of breath and life and bond with the land, with the water, with the hands of harvest and the Spirit who feeds and lives within us all. The Eucharist is meant to be this sacred ceremony of kinship. So we kind of ask, are we honoring that relationship? Are we consuming something that's sacred without listening to the story behind it, right? So what do we do and what do you take back from this summit today? Not slogans. I don't think we're going to hear about easy fixes. But you are going to take a practice back with you, right? A sacred embodied practice of showing up, of breathing deeply, and telling the truth. We carry the reminder that beauty of this community is a spiritual practice. That story is a ceremony. That hope is born not from avoidance, but from presence. And when we go back to our congregations, to our classrooms, to our communities, we can look at it this way. We can create space for hard stories. Let grief and that beauty kind of live and sit side by side, right? Reclaim ritual as relationship. Let communion ask who grew the grain, right? Who picked the grapes? Let your youth ask those bold questions. Let your elders speak to some of the wisdom that they carry. Let the land, let the community have a voice. And above all, I think it's just remembering that we are not alone. If you take just one thing home, I think, from what I am understanding of this gathering, let it be this, and it is just make space for one story today, one truth, and then tell it, hold it, honor it, don't forget it, because stories are seeds, right? And stories are how we begin again. And remember, you are not alone, that you are a part of something larger, that you are a thread in that tapestry that stretches way across time and struggle and beauty. And what you do with your breath, your presence, your life, it matters. So we breathe, even when it's hard. Those are prayers. And we push, even when it's hard, because we're asked to. And we show up, even when it's hard, because our family needs us. So that is together how we embody courage. And together that is how we birth something new. Amen.